Thanks for joining us for the May edition of Forage Focus. It's a pleasure to be back with you in the studio to record, and on today's video, we will be talking about the Coronavirus Food Assistance Program, how it applies to ruminant producers in Ohio. We'll also discuss fertilizing pastures in the early summer and how to make hay in the rain. Stay tuned.
Welcome to another episode of Forage Focus with host Christine Gelley. Christine is an extension educator in Noble County. She's with the Agriculture Natural Resources Program, and she has been very actively involved in a variety of different issues, ranging from 4-H programs, livestock, what it takes to keep your ground fertile. And Christine, it's always a pleasure being involved with you in Forage Focus.
It's a pleasure to be here. I've certainly missed being on the show. We missed a couple months of our normal programming, and it's good to be back. And I hope that the issues we're seeing are eventually going to swing upward towards the good again. And we're excited to share some of the ways that will hopefully help that happen in the coming months.
Well, you have my curiosity in the 4-H livestock, the 4-H programs. How has the coronavirus affected those programs?
Well, the most obvious way that coronavirus has affected the forage industry is directly through livestock and the animals that consume those forage products. So some of the differences between our livestock production systems and our crop production systems are that our livestock cannot be stored for the long term, the same way that we store food commodities like corn and beans and wheat. You can't simply take a cow and put it into a grain bin and save it for when the demand goes up or processing needs change. So what we have seen is the disruption of the supply chain and how food moves through it has created a bottleneck for livestock processing. And so that affects how many livestock are on the farm at a given time, where they're moving next, and the ability of the consumer to purchase those products through the normal avenue that they would, whether that's at the grocery store, at the drive-through, a high-end restaurant, or from a family farm down the road. So there's multiple ways to look at it. If you are a direct marketer that sells freezer meats from your farm, now is a great time to do business. Everyone is looking for a local product that they can buy. But if you are a contracted producer that sends a semi-load of animals every week to be processed, this is a significant disruption to your system. And so all of that relates back to forages and their demand and how we're going to manage them for animals like cattle, sheep, goats, and other livestock that are on forages primarily for their diet. Horses are less impacted, but since they're involved a lot in recreational sports, and those have been put on hold for quite some time, there's disruption there as well. But that's where we've seen the most loss and the most disruption to the supply chain is in how it affects the inventory of animals on the farm and how we will feed them.
I noticed that a number of different food processing plants have had to close or limit their work environment because of so many individuals getting sick. Are we starting to see that become better?
Yes, it is beginning to improve. And we were lucky that in Ohio, most of our processors did remain open. They didn't fully close. However, we have a lot of livestock that still go out of state for processing. So as the industry has adopted safety measures to create a safe working environment and employees have felt safe enough to come back to work, they have been able to reopen. And while they're not functioning at full capacity, the strain of that bottleneck of livestock getting into process has been relieved some, not completely, but significantly better than where we were 2 or 3 weeks ago.
I noticed that there is a number of large food processing, meat processing packets, but there's also smaller ones. Are they an integral part of the food processing of the animals?
Absolutely, they are. And that creates another challenge that we see. If anybody was paying attention to social media in the past month, once the public found out about this bottleneck of products and the idea that some of these livestock may need to be euthanized to create space to put more. You know, if you're in a constant system where you have young being born and young and mature animals leaving the farm, you can't just stop. Those animals have to go somewhere. So it really raised a lot of public concern once people started realizing the severity of the situation. And members of the general public thought, well, we'll just go to the farm and we'll just buy animals from the farmer and we'll save them. And then we'll just get it processed locally. And that's a plausible option as long as your local processor has the capacity to take on those animals. And what we're seeing is that they don't. Most of our smaller processors are booked for months at this point. So trying to find an appointment to get animals processed is difficult. They're absolutely an important part of this process. We wouldn't be where we are right now without them. They've been operating as usual and adopting the same safety procedures as the big guys. But the smaller processors simply can't absorb that capacity disruption that we're seeing. So yes, it is integral, but we can't just solve the problem by shifting processing to smaller processors.
We have cycles in the beef and cattle and the different animals. Because of the virus, we have effectively lost 3 or 4 months. Does that affect the cycles of processing the different animals?
Yes, it does. One of the big disruptions to that was the loss, so to speak, of the Easter holiday, which is very detrimental to the sheep industry. So we see peak demands in the United States for lamb products around Easter and especially around Christmas, as well as with a lot of Middle Eastern holidays like Ramadan. And when folks aren't able to gather together to celebrate those, they're not purchasing as they normally would. Many auctions were canceled or offered in a different format than they normally are around those holidays. So it did create a big challenge for lamb in that time frame, because the market for those Easter lambs are typically smaller framed animals, very young animals. So our producers now had to figure out, am I going to sell these and take a loss, or am I going to keep them and try to feed them for 5 months until they're that 95 to 110 pound animal that we would traditionally market? So yes, it has really shifted how people are thinking about, how many lambs do I want to have in the fall? I'm not going to market the same way this year as I had before. So do I want fewer? Do I want more? It's affecting all industries for sure, but I did want to share that piece about lamb because it was significantly affected by Easter.
And I would imagine that with goats and some of the other less traditional kinds of meats. So I assume that everyone eats lots of cattle products, but we have a variety of different animals that ethnic groups use, or they're the more non-traditional foods. What about chickens? Have they been affected also?
Yes, chickens have been affected. Eggs, less so. When you watch how the patterns of how people panic bought products early on, everybody bought eggs. Everybody knows how to cook an egg. Chicken as well is a much more familiar meat people would consider it more user-friendly than larger cuts of meats or unfamiliar species. So demand for chicken and eggs continued to be good. Chicken, however, did have some issues as well with the processing for broilers because they would be sent to a large processor as well, and the same issues with, say, the Tyson plants closing. Many chickens are processed by Tyson, so that created some bottlenecking as well. And a lot of those programs where they were prepared for euthanasia programs were related to swine and poultry because it's such a quick turnaround for those products, and many of them are on regular contract agreements. So it was a concern. It did certainly impact those producers, but I think a lot less than what it could have been had the plants not opened as quickly as they did again.
One of the things that I've noticed in May, it's been a very wet May, and it's been a very cool April. At least in southern Ohio. Has that created more of a problem for the animals not being processed?
Not really for them not being processed. What it does create some issues with is how we manage our pastures with those conditions. Green up was a bit slow this spring because we were so cold early in the spring. So our pastures weren't quite as ready to put animals on to graze as they have been in previous years when you look at the same date on the calendar. So that caused some concerns with when do I put my animals out on pasture? How do I deal with these animals? Those same questions of keep them or get them out of here, ship them or keep them, has a lot to do with how much grass you have available. And then the grass really started growing when we got a little bit warmer and we got a lot of rain. The grass will grow well in the rain as long as we're not flooded, but then the issues that creates is, can we have animals out there to harvest the grass? Will they do more harm than good by being on saturated ground? And also, how do we mechanically harvest it? Because we simply can't make hay in the rain. It's impossible to do and do well. So what do we do to try to make the best of it? That's something that we're going to talk a little bit more here in a minute.
Yeah, I would very much like to, because now is the season for growing corn, for livestock, for the different grains, etc. And I'm curious, the cycles that we are so used to have been very disrupted.
We will see that with forages as well. It sounds a little bit like a broken record because we've had the same issues in early spring for the past 3 years when it comes to forages. It's too wet to harvest at the ideal time for the maturity of our crop, which would be our grasses, our clovers, our alfalfa. Those plants are at their ideal growth time right now. The temperature is right, the sunlight is right, they're receiving more than enough moisture, which means that they're going to proceed through their life cycle at a fast pace now. And when our forage crops mature, their quality goes down. So the speed up of their life cycle is not helpful for us as managers if we're trying to get out and harvest them, because that moisture is very prohibitive.
I know that there are many fields have been damaged here in parts of southern Ohio because of all the rain. And I know that this is a time in which everything should be springing up. And, I'm looking down the road, maybe in July, August, September. What do you see as the estimates of different fields that are growing plants for the cattle?
Well, I'm hopeful that when we get down the road into later summer, we'll feel like we're more back on track. We had kind of hoped that for last year as well, thinking, well, we'll dry out once we get to midsummer. The spring has been rough, but we'll dry out. And we did dry out. We got to the point where we had some drought conditions. We dried out a little too much, but that's part of the game of farming. You're never really fully satisfied with the conditions you're given. But what we see as we move into July, August, September is we typically have drier conditions in the state of Ohio. So it is really critical how we choose to manage our forages right now so that they will be healthy and producing well once we get later into the season. And one of the ways to ensure that is to apply nutrients appropriately at the right times so that those plants are ready to harvest later in the season, just as they are now.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the fertilization. Are you seeing that what we have been doing the last 4, 5, 6 years in regards to fertilization, we're on task now, or because of the coronavirus, we're having to readjust?
I think that because of the coronavirus, this has, for some people, at least in my area, if they were laid off from work, they've suddenly found more time to farm at home. So some of these practices may actually be more on track this year than they have been before because people have been home more and they can focus more on their part-time venture, which is farming. So there was a patch there where we had good condition to apply stored manure that people would have had left over from the winter. It's good to get that applied on as soon as the ground is dry enough and we have no snow. And that's great for green up in the early spring. I'm hoping that people will remember good fertility practices as we get to making first cutting hay, because after first cutting is a really critical time to apply fertilizer because remember, we've defoliated the plants, we've taken away a lot of their ability to absorb sunlight, to conduct photosynthesis, to send energy to their root systems. So after first cutting, they're going to be pulling a lot of reserves up from the roots to create new growth. And if we want to get a really good second and potential third cutting, applying nutrients after first cutting hay is a great way to refresh those plants and gear up for the next harvest cycle. So we want to remind people that if you have fertilizer in storage right now and you're upset that it's raining and you can't apply it, don't worry, you're going to have an opportunity to do that after first cutting, and that is probably the most beneficial time that you can do that throughout the season anyway. We'd also encourage people to fertilize in the fall as plants get ready to overwinter so that they've got a good root system on them going into winter as well. So it's not too late to fertilize, and I hope that folks who have been spending more time at home on the farm have had a little bit more time to get some of these tasks done that may have been delayed in a normal work situation.
Invasive plants, are you seeing that there's going to be more of a problem this year because of the wet May, or is it just sort of a natural thing that occurs every year?
The pressure from invasive species continues to be strong year after year as more species become present in our environment, so that increases our risk of having issues. But something really interesting that some of our educators in the northern part of Ohio are talking about right now is fallow syndrome, which would be, we had a lot of prevent plant acres last year that didn't have corn or beans on them as they normally would. That land sat fallow. That's an excellent place for weeds to take hold. And without the normal crop practice being in place, they've been allowed to grow, they've put on seed, they may have spread further out from those locations. So I think that not just in agronomic cropland, but down here in Southeast Ohio, more headed west as well, we may see more issues in addition because of those conditions last year that prevented normal production and having weeds spread from that central source. So yeah, I think we will probably see more issues with invasives this year, but I think we see more issues with invasives every successing.
We want to make our lands as best as possible. Do you feel that the cattle will overuse the land because there's so many more head of cattle on the range?
That's difficult for me to answer. I think here in Ohio, it won't be nearly as drastic as it would be in more western states. This time of year, grass is plentiful, and we sometimes have an issue with not being able to graze it fast enough. So as long as demand continues to be high and processing continues to approach somewhere near normal, I hope that we won't have this over surplus on the farm issue last for a significantly longer time. I hope that by the time we get into later summer, when it gets heated and we start to lose productivity in the grassland, that we will have successfully moved more of those cattle off the farm to the next production phase. But it is possible in some situations, if you're at max capacity on animals, you could run short on pasture to graze them. And that in itself can lead you into more issues with weeds. Specifically, poisoning is a lot more common from weeds in an overgrazed situation because the animals are hungry and they are foraging in places they normally wouldn't. So they tend to make poorer choices on forage selection when there's fewer things to choose from. So we do want to watch out in those situations where overgrazing might be a problem, and specifically scout for poisonous weeds and be prepared with a backup program to provide forage products via hay or baleage or supplemental feed by grain.
I know that you're very actively involved with a number of different farmers, and some of the things that you provide during the summer months as well as throughout the year have been educational programs because of the coronavirus, because of some of the mandates from the state and from OSU. How have you been able to keep pace with educating the newer farmers or doing research or things of that nature?
I'm glad you asked that question, Patrick. It certainly has been a challenge to adapt how we're doing programming through extension, but we're still very actively doing it. We are trying to be present on all of the virtual platforms, whether that's social media, online through our county websites, on YouTube, posting educational videos, hosting virtual events through Zoom, so by webinar or open meeting rooms. Many colleagues that are in the same position as I am are having open coffee hour, like come have coffee with me on Thursday mornings and bring your questions. Trying to create that open office feel, but through a virtual platform. That's how we're trying to deliver those programs. Many of them have been delayed or postponed and many canceled. But as we continue to plan our traditional programs, we're trying to adapt them to a virtual format as much as possible. And we understand that in Southern Ohio especially, we have connectivity issues. Much of rural America has connective issues with trying to utilize the internet and those platforms. So continuing to produce things in print, in the newspaper, and making phone calls, returning phone calls as quickly as possible is still extremely important to us because we know not all of our clientele are tech savvy and accessing these newer formats for education.
Yeah, and I know that Ohio State University, the extension program, the agricultural programs have been very supportive of helping you to meet those particular needs. And I know that the state of Ohio is always concerned, our agriculture, which includes beef and cattle and livestock, that is one of the major industries that affects the economies of the state of Ohio. Do you feel that the state of Ohio has been very responsive to some of your needs?
Well, as far as my needs personally as an educator, yes, I do. I've been really impressed with how the university has taken care of us as staff members and tried to address our needs as quickly as possible, knowing that many of us live in the same communities that we're trying to serve. We're not all on campus. They have made drastic efforts to try to supply us with the technology resources that we need to be successful. I do feel that they have the health and safety of us and our clients in mind. And they have been very flexible with us to allow us to continue to work, but also make the best decisions for our family. And going out from Ohio State and branching out to ODA and USDA, the staff is still there. They're still essential. They're still trying to help as much as we possibly can, while also following the best advice that's out there in this time.
Well, as a matter of fact, there are some upcoming things that you would like the listening audience to be aware of. And would you like to share some of those things?
Yes, absolutely. One of the big things that our viewers should be aware of is that the Coronavirus Food Assistance Program opens for enrollment on May 26th. You can access all the information about that USDA program on their website. We'll share the link to that information for you all. Many of our commodities related to forage production can qualify for assistance through that program. Forages themselves are not listed as one of the commodities, but your livestock are. Wool is as well. So if you've been trying to market products during this time frame and you have been significantly affected economically, you can sign up for that assistance program. It goes through the Farm Service Agency. So FSA is the one to contact, your local FSA office, and they can get you on the track to fill out the appropriate paperwork for that assistance program. Some of our other events that we plan to host, one of the big ones is the Ohio Forage and Grasslands Council sheep tour that we do the day before Ohio Sheep Day. We have made the decision to move Sheep Day to October 2nd and 3rd, I believe it would be, this year, rather than July. We will adapt the needs as announcements change, but at this point we're looking at a fall event in that case. And if we're not able to do it in person, we'll have a virtual event.
We are talking with Christine Gelley, is with the Agricultural Natural Resources with the Ohio State University. Christine, I want to thank you very much for presenting another very good telecast. I've learned a lot.
Thank you for having us again, Patrick. We enjoy having the show on the air and reaching out to our clientele.